Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to this virtual meeting of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. I'm Maria Zuber, one of the PCAST co-chairs, and welcome to the PCAST members, to members of the general public, and to our speakers for today. I'd like to remind all of you that this meeting is public and it is being recorded. The recording of this morning's sessions will be available on the PCAST website for anyone who misses the live stream. Now, I'd like to pass the proceedings over to other co-chair, Arthi Prabhakar, to introduce and moderate this morning's session. Arthi?
Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see all the PCAST faces and our three guests, but also welcome to everyone who's joining us online. We're doing a session today that I've really been looking forward to. I want to thank PCAST members John Levin and Jennifer Richardson for pulling it together. Our focus in this session is to look at recent advances in the social sciences. And this is important for all the obvious reasons that all the hard problems that we struggle with in this world, almost always at their root are humans and institutions and organizations and how they behave and what their incentives are. That is the business of social science to understand. But it's also, I think, a particularly interesting time to look at what's happening with social sciences because of the way the fields are changing and potentially in some very powerful ways that will help us solve some of the hardest problems that we have worked on as a species for many, many, many years and sometimes millennia. So I think it's a particularly opportune moment to do this. And we have three exceptional speakers. Thank you all for showing up to do this. Raj Chetty is joining us from Harvard, Josh Tucker from NYU, Katie Milkman from the University of Pennsylvania. Their bios are in the briefing materials and on the PCAST website for those of you, the public members who are joining us as well. So what I'll do is call on them in that order to make their presentations. Very much looking forward to hearing from the three of you, and then we'll have a healthy chunk of time for discussion. So let me start by turning it over to you, Raj.
Great. Thank you so much, Arthi, and thank you everyone for joining and for the invitation. So I'm going to share some slides here. Hopefully that's working for everyone. And so I'm going to take the opportunity today discussing advances in social science to focus on how the availability of large-scale data and new methods is transforming our ability to answer important economic and social policy questions. And I'm going to focus in particular on issues I've been studying on the science of economic opportunity. To motivate what I'll discuss, I want to start at a very big picture level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted, complex concept that has different meanings to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here to a very simple statistic that I think lies at the cornerstone of the American dream, which is the idea that through hard work, we aspire to be a country where any child can go on to have a higher standard of living than their parents had. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote that we published in Science a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration. And this chart here plots the results of what we found. We computed a very simple statistic. We asked what fraction of children go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring that statistic by the year in which the child was born. You can see here is that for children born in the middle of the last century, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. If you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the 1980s who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a 50-50 shot, a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream. Now, this trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself. It reflects a fundamental change in the American economy that we'd like to understand. I would argue it's also a fundamental social and political interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work. Now, naturally, the question of scientific interest here, I think, is to understand what is driving the fading of the American dream, and more broadly, what are the drivers of economic opportunity? How can you help kids have better chances of rising up, particularly kids from lower income backgrounds, from disadvantaged backgrounds? Traditionally in economics, we've faced a challenge of if you just look at these data points, you can think of 10 different things that have changed over the past 50 years that might explain what's going on. And it's very difficult to test between different theories, all of which might be plausible with macroeconomic data like this. Recently, we've started to get access to much larger scale data that allow us to essentially take a more microscopic approach, to make an analogy to biology, to study these kinds of questions. And so to give you a sense of that, I'm going to turn to this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility within the United States for recent cohorts. So let me first briefly describe how we construct this map, which will give you a sense of modern methodology in the social sciences, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we did here is took data on 20 million children and their parents drawn from anonymized tax returns covering the entire US population, working in collaboration with people at the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury. And using that data, we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility for 740 different metro and rural areas in the United States. We ask, what is the average household income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families, which we define as families at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which puts you at a household income for the parents of about $27,000 a year. So to give you an example, here in Boston, where I am, we see, using tax records covering the full population, that kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year end up on average making about $37,000 a year when they're adults in their mid-30s. So we can similarly compute that statistic for all of these various different areas, and we color the map so that red-orange colors represent places with lower levels of upward mobility, and blue-green colors represent places with higher levels of upward mobility. The first simple point I want to make here is there's, even in the present day, an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up in the United States. There are some places like Dubuque, Iowa, or much of the center of the country, where kids growing up in low-income families have terrific chances of rising up, on average, reaching the middle class or beyond. Yet there are other places in America, like Charlotte, North Carolina, where on average, one generation later, you actually have lower levels of income than your parents did, which is remarkable given the amount of economic growth that has occurred in the US in the past 30 years. So there's been a large field of research that has emerged since the availability of these sorts of data that basically seeks to answer, why are there these large differences in upward mobility across areas? And what can we do going forward to increase upward mobility in places that are more disadvantaged? I won't have time to go into detail on what that analysis looks like, but in brief, we've learned that places have causal effects on upward mobility. This is not just about sorting with different people living in different places. And factors like social capital, who you're connected with, using rich data from Facebook and other sources, is a key predictor of differences in economic mobility, as well as access to high quality education, the degree of income inequality in an area, and so forth. We've made quite a bit of progress in understanding, in that sense, the science of economic opportunity. Now, what I want to do in the last couple of minutes here is show you how that kind of scientific understanding and these new data can be relevant, not just from an academic perspective, but also, very importantly, from a policy perspective, to actually change people's lives and increase upward mobility going forward. And so, motivated by the body of research that I just very briefly described to you, in our research team, we're focusing on 3 different types of policy approaches to increase upward mobility, which we think stem naturally from this finding that the roots of economic opportunity are hyper-local and depend greatly upon the particular area in which you're growing up. One approach is to reduce segregation and help families move to places that offer better opportunities for upward mobility. Another approach is to make place-based investments and try to turn the red-colored areas in the map that I've been showing you into blue-green colored places. And the third approach, recognizing that after age 18, the key touch point for most kids is not the house that they're growing up in, but the institution of higher education that they're attending, make interventions in our higher education system, in our colleges, to amplify their impacts on upward mobility. I could talk in detail about each of these. What I'm going to do is briefly give you an example from this first bucket of how, using these sorts of data and methods, we can have a direct impact on policy to make existing policies more effective than they currently are. So to do that, I'm going to give you another snapshot of this opportunity atlas data on rates of upward mobility across different areas, where here we're zooming in further relative to the national map that I showed you, and showing you the data specifically in the Seattle metro area, where an interesting finding that you can immediately see from this map, where we have not changed the color scale relative to the national map, is that there's a tremendous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up in different neighborhoods in Seattle. There are some red-colored places where kids don't have great prospects of rising up, and there are other places where opportunities for upward mobility look much greater. Now, what we've done here is overlaid in the bright green dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. For those who may not have this context, we spend about $45 billion per year in the US on affordable housing programs, a big component of which are these housing vouchers that are basically rental assistance to help families find housing in better areas. Now, what you can see is a kind of surprising pattern, which is despite the fact that these families are getting $1,500 a month of rental assistance, they're concentrated in the red and orange colored parts of Seattle, not the blue-green colored parts of Seattle, where we know from our prior work, they're much more likely to break the cycle of poverty. So what we did when folks noticed this pattern in housing authorities and the Housing and Urban Development Agency and contacted us when we put out these data is teamed up with the Seattle and King County housing authorities to design a randomized trial to help families with housing vouchers move to higher opportunity neighborhoods through essentially a social capital or counseling intervention, basically giving them support in the housing search process to move to a high opportunity area if they wanted to do so. We ran that as an RCT, and you can follow families over time and look at where they ended up moving. And what you can see is that this relatively low-cost intervention of providing a little bit of support and basically using the money that the government's already giving you more effectively dramatically changes where families choose to live. 55% of families in the treatment group that got these additional services end up moving to high opportunity places where we estimate that their kids are going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes, compared to those in the control group where only 14% move to high opportunity areas. Last piece of this to show you how this kind of research matters, not just for seeing how these programs work, but actually has a direct impact on policy. After we did that work in Seattle, there was a bill passed with bipartisan sponsors in Congress, a Republican Democratic senator, to expand what we did in Seattle to 9 other cities across the country. And there's now another bill working its way through Congress, again with bipartisan sponsors, to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year, motivated by a lot of the evidence I've been showing you here and focusing exactly on these counseling supports and designing the program in a much more effective way. So I'm not going to give you examples from the other areas, but I think there's similar things that one can do and have been done in each of these other domains. I want to end instead with one final point that I think would be particularly relevant for this group, which is I think these issues matter not just from the perspective of justice and fairness and thinking about the American dream, but also from the more practical perspective of trying to keep America at the frontier of economic growth and innovation. And to show you that, I'm just going to give you one final data point here from a different study we've done, looking at inventors in America and plotting patent rates by linking the universe of patent records to tax records versus parent income. And what you can see here is if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're about 10 times more likely to become an inventor as measured by having a patent, as if you happen to be born to parents below the median of the income distribution. So in that sense, there are many lost Einsteins in America. We estimate in the study that if women, kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds and kids from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, we would have 4 times as many inventors in America as we currently do. And I think what that underscores is the importance of studying these kinds of issues with modern social science methods and trying to make changes in policy to benefit all of us going forward. Thanks so much.
Raj, thank you so much for sharing that slice of a much larger body of work that you've done over many years. And now let's turn to Josh.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to present to you here to talk to you here all today. I'm going to talk to you about social science in the 21st century. And in particular, I'm going to talk to you about the kind of social science research that I've been working on, which is trying to study the relationship between social media and politics. Now, in this field of what we're doing here with social science research and in particular political science research in the 21st century, we have all these huge new questions that we can ask about politics in the context of the new digital information environment? These are questions that are of huge interest to science, and lots of these were questions we wouldn't even be thinking about asking 20 years ago. But they're also questions that are of vital importance to society and to policymakers. So we want to know things like, how does social media affect political polarization? How does it affect who's participating in politics or competence in democratic institutions? We've also seen the rise of all sorts of new concerns with this digital information environment, like, are people being self-placing themselves into echo chambers where they're only hearing from people with similar views, or what are also known as filter bubbles? Or what's the impact of foreign influence campaigns when we have foreign governments that are trying to manipulate the information environment in our country, especially around elections? And there's been a whole new rise of online harms and what that does for people's opportunities to participate, much along the ways that Raj was talking about before. And then we have these questions here in this new digital information environment when we're not just buying the New York Times and opening that to read, but wondering about how people identify the veracity of news in this new online environment world. And also things like how algorithms lead people, or do they lead people, to politically extreme ideological content when they didn't go searching for that in the first place. In a moment, I'm going to show you some studies that we've done at the Center for Social Media and Politics on the last three of these topics. But what I want to talk about first is the fact that why what we're doing now is so different from the political science that I was doing even when I was in college, and what we tend to think of and when we remember doing, what political science feels like. And the key thing here is that all of this in many ways is driven by the massive increases in computing power that have emerged in recent years. Now, we think of that as a social, we think of that as a technical innovation, but it's having this huge impact on the way that we can study politics, and indeed the questions we have to ask about politics today. So first off, as a political scientist, the type of data that I used to work with, and my background is in post-communist politics, would involve collecting data from administrative sources, kind of some of the things that Raj was talking about, although at much smaller scale, like election results. It also was data that political scientists themselves were creating by running experiments in the lab or carrying out surveys. Today, we have the ability to analyze these enormous data sets from digital trace data. In the digital world, human beings, when they interact with just about everything in their life, are leaving behind digital traces. Social science is the sort of study of how humans interact with the world. Political science, the study of how humans interact with the political world. So for me, I'm particularly interested in this digital trace data that's left behind by social media. But it's not just the power of this digital trace data, and Raj was giving you a sense of this before, it's how we can link different data sets now. So we can link this digital trace data with things like surveys or things like administrative data. And this gives us the ability to ask sort of powerful new questions and come up with answers that we wouldn't have been able to before. The same increase, the availability of this data, but also the availability of this massive computing power, has led to a fundamental change in how we think about the methods that we're able to use in the study of politics now. And nothing is, I think, perhaps more important than the fact that we can now use text and images as data. And if we think about the amount of text there is in the world as opposed to the amount of numbers there in this world, this just brings so much more information to bear on the types of analyses we're doing. And with the advent of these texts and images as data, this gives rise to methods like machine learning, which are becoming increasingly prevalent in the study of politics. And of course, AI, large language models, and chatbots, which I'm not going to show in my examples right now, but which we can talk more about during the Q&A, because that's becoming a big deal too. All right, so what I want to just take my time here is to show you sort of the importance of doing this kind of modern 21st century rigorous social science, because of what we end up finding when we look at sort of the conventional wisdom in my field about social media and politics versus what we can learn from this kind of social science research. So to give one example, this is from hate speech in the 2016 election. The conventional wisdom on hate speech in the 2016 election, and you would have seen lots of reports about this in the media, was that it was just increasing over the course of this campaign. And indeed, if we were going to draw a histogram or some sort of relationship between the prevalence of hate speech over time, we'd expect to see something like this graph on the right from what the conventional wisdom was. But it turns out when at the Center for Social Media and Politics, we looked at over 1.2 billion tweets over the course of this time period, tweets that were either about politics or tweets that were from a random sample of US Twitter users that we were following what they were doing on Twitter, we found a very different picture, which was that hate speech turns out to be bursty in the sense that it goes up quite a bit in reaction to events at particular points in time, but then it comes back down and tends to re-equilibrate back to the level where it was. But it was not increasing systematically over time from 2015 to 2017. This figure on the right here is from this paper, which we published on this, which looks at anti-Muslim hate speech, but we found similar patterns for hate speech overall and different types of hate speech. Here's another example. Think about you encounter something online, you encounter a news story, you're not sure if it's true. What's the conventional wisdom here? Well, probably that you should go out and look for more information about it to see if you can find additional information. Part of the reason that's conventional wisdom, it's intuitive. Part of the reason is we see it in lots of tips and guides on what to do to be able to correctly find true news online. However, it turns out when we built these pipelines to source news articles to people from in real time, we ran study after study. And what we found over and over again was that actually searching for information online makes people more likely to believe that false news is true, not less likely to believe that it's true. So this is, again, what we get from research. Conventional wisdom tells us one thing. We do these kind of large-scale studies, we can learn other things. Here's another another case of example here. One of the things that we hear a lot in the media is about the possibility of algorithms driving people, in particular on YouTube, to more extremist content inadvertently, that people start off on moderate level content, and then the algorithm ends up serving them and they end up falling down a rabbit hole. We've seen stories about this, headlines about this being the case. At the Center for Social Media and Politics, we came up with a way to create essentially like a digital footprint of a YouTube traversal when you follow the YouTube recommendation algorithm, drawing on large sorts of data from Reddit and combining this with links to YouTube videos. We came up with a way to estimate the ideological extremity or the ideological placement of a video. And from everything that we've heard about these kind of rabbit holes, you would expect to see a footprint that kind of like the one that I'm showing you here on the lower left, where someone starts off with moderate content, but then the algorithm sucks them into this more extremist content. But actually, it turns out when we ran this study and we were able to isolate out the effect of the algorithm from the effect of user choice by recruiting actual humans with real user histories to participate in these studies, but instructing them on how to proceed through these traversals, we find something very different, which is that actually we get many, many footprints that look like the one I'm showing you here on the right. And it turns out that these rabbit holes are actually quite rare. Now, this doesn't mean there aren't reasons to be concerned with content and extremist content on YouTube, but it means we may be misguided by continually focusing on the algorithm as opposed to focusing on other questions, such as how YouTube can be used as a repository for extremist content that people who are actively trying to radicalize and to radicalize others can draw upon. Now, I've just tried to show you just a sort of smattering of the kind of things we can do in this new world of 21st century social science for the questions that we're interested about social media and politics and social media and society. But there are real challenges that exist around this. The first of these is that to do this kind of 21st century social science, there are extreme gains to efficiency to be had to be doing this kind of work at scale. Indeed, to be doing it in a lab-based format. There's a reason that the natural sciences decades ago migrated to doing lab-based types of research. And we're finding that this is, when you have these large data sets, when you're developing these new methods, it's of great value to be able to centralize the data collection, to be able to have people working collaboratively on developing the methods. But the funding structure is not there for this. There's a funding structure to support labs in the natural sciences. We don't really have that in the social sciences yet. So that's one big challenge. A second challenge has to do with data. As I mentioned earlier, data that we've worked with historically as political scientists has been administrative data that states make available, or it's been data that we create ourselves as political scientists, or it's been reading of texts and things like that. But the type of data that I'm talking about here today is technically owned by private actors. And indeed, while there are lots of different ways we can go about doing this research, and I'm happy to talk much more about it during the discussion, at the end of the day, we are ultimately at the whim of the platforms for getting access to this data, no matter what types of approaches we're taking here. So as we move forward and think about what kinds of things we can do to facilitate this research that's sort of crucially important for advancing scientific understanding, but also for understanding how our society works in this digital information era and how we can address these challenges that I started this talk with here today, we really do have to think seriously about how to make sure that researchers have access to this data, and it's not just at the decision of the platforms when this research should take place. I want to just close with a slide to show you, this is our lab at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU. It really does take a village to do this kind of research. And I wanted to say thank you once again for the opportunity to talk to you here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Josh, thank you so much. I thought that was a really nice exposition of how your field is changing and also some great examples. And now let's turn to Katie.
Wonderful. Hopefully everything is working. I'm really excited to talk to you about whether or not behavioral insights can rise to meet public policy challenges. So a slightly different topic, though certainly related to what I just spoke about. I want to start with a definition. I want to talk about two different types of tools we've traditionally thought about using for addressing policy challenges. So the typical tool that's been used most widely in government would be an economic insight. So think about a policy challenge like trying to get people to pay their taxes on time. You'd want to use an economic insight potentially to change the tangible costs and benefits of that decision. So you might say there's a fine if your taxes don't come in on time, or you'll be banned from this activity if your taxes don't come in on time. But I'm going to focus more today on behavioral insights, which actually don't change those cost-benefit trade-offs, but instead try to address psychological barriers to follow through. So in the context of, say, tax filing on time, you might send a timely reminder to address the challenge of forgetfulness. And in a different context, there could be a different behavioral barrier. I want to give you a couple of concrete examples of behavioral insights that have had big benefits, just to make sure this idea is really concrete first. And I'll start with one of our blockbusters, which is that in the context of retirement savings, we might want to encourage more people, for instance, at an employer to save so they'll have comfortable retirements in a 401k plan. And traditionally what we do is make sure that there's paperwork maybe on the first day of work where they can easily enroll in a tax advantaged retirement plan. And we'd think that'd be plenty. Well, there was a wonderful paper that came out about 20 years ago showing actually it really matters how you frame that decision. In fact, if you automatically enroll employees in a corporate retirement plan and invite them to opt out by checking a box, as opposed to inviting them to opt in by checking a box, a trivial change, that default matters. In fact, in this particular study, there was a 76% increase in enrollment by automatically enrolling people, making it the path of least resistance. I'll give you another example in a different context, and this is some of my own team's research. We were looking at the issue of vaccination, and this was during the H1N1 flu season, and take yourself back in time over a decade. An employer that was holding free flu shot clinics knew that they had to provide information about the locations, the times, that these were free, it was happening. And we said, we can actually build in a behavioral insight we think would make it better. Let's run an RCT and compare two different ways of doing this. So there was the standard way. And we said, what if we add a simple planning prompt to prompt people to write down the date and time when they intend to come in and get a vaccine? We know from past research that these kinds of planning prompts actually help people follow through. They make the commitment firmer, they embed plans more firmly in memory, and make it more likely it ends up on the calendar and that you don't forget as a result. This isn't an appointment card, just that simple in the privacy of your own home prompt a plan, and it increased vaccination rates 12% in our randomized controlled trial. So based on these kinds of insights, not these in particular, many of them, and popularized by a wonderful book written by Nobel laureate Richard Thaler and the great Cass Sunstein in 2008 called Nudge, there is a sort of thriving industry of behavioral insights units now operating globally. Many are in governments, but many are also in the private sector. And they're trying to use these kinds of insights to change behavior primarily for the better, though sometimes also in for-profit cases for profit. Really useful recent analysis showed that in general, when we looked at the tools deployed by UK behavioral insights teams to try to change behavior. The benefits are meaningful, but they aren't huge. So I think we want to make sure we're tempered in our enthusiasm about this. This showed that if you send a better designed text message or a better designed mailing, we tend to see something like an change in the target behavior. You're trying to get more people to pay their sewer bill or to pay their taxes on time, whatever it might be. You can get some change, but these aren't huge effects, or like a 1.39 percentage point change. But what a team that I was involved in showed is that even though they're small effects, and that's important to keep in mind, they're very cost effective. So when we look at the benefit per dollar spent, because we're not having to say, match your retirement contributions when we change the design of the sign-up process, we get a lot more bang for our buck. So these kinds of behavioral insights can be great complements to more traditional policy tools. So these are just showing you those black bars are showing behavioral insights compared to more traditional insights from a big lit in a couple of policy settings. Retirement savings, we see big cost benefit, high cost benefit, or excuse me, I should say low cost benefit ratios in these different contexts. And then energy conservation and influenza vaccinations, and doing a similar sort of analysis, we see similar things. So basically, it's very cost effective. But again, the effects aren't always huge. We want to do these things together. Okay, but a key question I want to turn to for the remainder of my time is that one challenge with these behavioral insights is that we often don't know which will be most useful. In the context of using economic insights, it's clearer to say if it's a really big problem, we'll levy a larger fine or a bigger tax, we'll use bigger incentives or bans with larger consequences. But when it comes to something like a default or a planning prompt, it's sort of hard to compare. How are they going to turn out? So of course, the gold standard is to use traditional field experiments to see, does it matter if we insert a planning prompt, if we use a default or another behavioral insight here? What my team focuses on is a new methodology that we think is particularly important for test insights, but also traditional insights, and that is trying to test many more ideas simultaneously in what we call mega studies. So this ties to what Josh was saying about sort of increase in big data, making these kinds of things possible. We have a team of about 160 scientists from diverse disciplines, and when we problem, we try to tackle it in these mega studies. So we will go out to the team and say, what are your best ideas? And then we'll test them all simultaneously in a very large experiment, an A to Z test with the same outcome that we're measuring. We've done tests like this to try to increase gym attendance, to try to increase savings, vaccination, to get kids to spend more time on an online math platform. But just to give you a flavor, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the work we've done to try to figure out for those who are already intending to get a vaccine, how can we encourage follow through at a higher rate, which was motivated by the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine during the pandemic. So we actually run two in the fall of 2020 to try to help inform messaging efforts so we could figure out what will be the best way to talk to people about COVID-19 vaccination. And this was a pressing policy problem, so we don't want to just throw out one idea. Let's test a lot and see what's the winner. You can think of it as a horse race. You can also do tailoring and figure out what works best for whom when you test many things simultaneously. So we did two mega studies or tournaments. One involved a test where we were communicating with patients who had upcoming healthy visits with a doctor at either Penn Medicine or Geisinger Health, two Northeastern health systems, and about 50,000 people were in that mega study. And the other was in partnership with Walmart Pharmacy, involving almost 700,000 of their patients and encouraging them to come in for a vaccine. And we were testing on flu. Those were already available, but every scientist involved was designing ideas that they hoped would be portable to reuse for COVID-19 vaccination. We did this with text messaging in both contexts. We tested dozens of different text messages. In the doctor's appointment case, the message would go out a few days before your appointment. Everyone got a reminder about their appointment, but some also got a reminder that a flu shot would be offered and encourage them in different ways to accept it. And in the pharmacy context, patients simply received a reminder message in the fall of 2020, encouraging them to come in for a flu vaccine. Sorts of different ideas. I'm giving you kind of a sample here. And now I'm going to show you what we learned and how this works. And on the x-axis, I'm showing you the estimated percent of patients coming in and getting a vaccine. In the context of doctor's appointments, this is who says yes when they're offered one and gets that vaccine. And what you can see, first of all, is a baseline group that isn't getting these reminders is getting vaccines at about a 42% rate. And we see that our very best performer lifts that by almost 10% or 5 percentage points. We also see all the reminders are beneficial. So reminders work. Our key finding from this study was that using ownership language, saying a vaccine is reserved for you, was very effective, and that the more formal the message, the better. Some of my favorite candidates and other scientists' favorite candidates, things like trying to use a little humor or encouraging people to protect, really underperformed our expectations. So that was really useful. In a second study with Walmart, we found very similar things were better powered here. You can see that actually every single reminder tested here outperformed our control in terms of the rate of vaccination subsequently. And interestingly, we couldn't use reserve for you language there. They were worried about stockouts, but we see a very similar ownership message rose to the top. And I should mention that the top several messages use ownership language in both of these tests and none of the rest do. So that was a really clear winner, was making it feel like it already belongs to you, which from past research, we know the degree to which you value something, the degree to which you feel it's recommended, and your sense there will be hassle factors associated with getting it. We also saw repeated reminders were particularly useful. And in some happy news, some members of our team then at the beginning of the COVID-19 rollout tested ownership language compared to standard reminder messages with COVID vaccines. And just as we hoped, indeed, this was a portable insight and it did outperform standard text reminders. And now we see this in really wide use. Almost every pharmacy is using some form of reserve for you or waiting for you language when they're messaging patients, and lots of health systems are doing the same. So I want to share one last sort of hot off the I was going to say presses, but it's not out yet. It's sort of hot off the spreadsheets. Results from a recent mega study last fall, where we wanted to go beyond behavioral insights and look also at an important economic insight. There was a lot spent on offering free rides to vaccine appointments, and we said, let's see how that does. And we ran a mega study where that was one of the ideas tested. We reminded CVS pharmacy customers to come in and get a COVID-19 booster if they had already received their other COVID-19 vaccinations. This was last fall, and some were offered a free round trip ride in a Lyft. And it was made very easy to get that. And others, we just tried rewording the reminder in different ways to see how much it would work. Good news, we again see that simple reminders do increase vaccination rates. So using that simple waiting for you message was helpful. However, there was absolutely no benefit of providing these free rides, despite the fact that they were high cost, and despite the fact that we and other experts and lay people were sure this would be the best performer of those tested. Instead, we saw some benefits, though, from different messaging strategies, like prompting people to make a plan and suggesting a date and time when they had gotten vaccinated before as a good candidate. So let me wrap up here and just say, I hope I've convinced you that behavioral insights can help address pressing policy challenges alongside economic insights, that they can be very cost effective to use and complementary. And finally, that mega studies are a useful tool for identifying the best candidates for behavioral insights and economic insights to solve policy problems. Sometimes we really don't know what will be most useful. And I think we should have many more such mega study tests in government to figure out what is the best use of our dollars.
Katie, thank you so much for that. I'm trying to think what it means that people didn't want to hear a joke about the flu. Maybe it just means the flu is no joking matter. I thought that was interesting. And like Josh's, some of Josh's work, I think it's really interesting when you see examples that are very different than what people, what the conventional wisdom says. So I think that's a lot of fun to see. So for PCAST members, please think about questions you want to ask. Raise your hand. I'll call on you in turn. Okay, I don't have to fill the gap. I think we got tons of questions. So Bill Daly, let's start with you.
Yeah, I have a question for Raj. I think it's very disheartening to see sort of the American dream has fallen by the wayside for at least half the population of this particular cohort. I realized it was a selected group, not everybody in the country. Has anybody dug deeper on that to sort of find some underlying causes. I mean, certainly the people by 1980, their parents were the people in 1940, and maybe the parents did well enough it was hard to beat that bar, or perhaps it's income inequality has just skewed things so there's less left for other people. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Bill, thanks. Absolutely. So in that paper, we take a step towards trying to understand what's going on. And I should note, our sense is this is not just kind of a blip. This is a steady secular trend, and there have been subsequent studies done using other cohorts and so forth. And I think for recent cohorts, you do see much lower chances of doing better than your parents. So the way I think about it first from a macroeconomic perspective is there are two factors that determine whether you're going to do better than your parents. One is just the overall GDP growth rate. If the economy, if the total size of the pie is growing more rapidly, then obviously you're going to have more people have a shot of doing better than their parents. But the second, which you touched upon, is also how that pie is divided. If, to take an extreme example, one person gets all of the economic growth in the past 30 years, if you have tremendous skew in the distribution of growth, then you can end up with only 50% of people doing better than their parents, even if you had the same GDP growth rates. So we do some analysis in this paper to figure out the relative contribution in an accounting sense of two changes in the American economy over the past half century. First, the slowdown in GDP growth rates. There's about a 1 percentage point reduction in GDP growth rates in the past 40 years relative to the middle of the last century. So that contributes to part of it. And then the other is to assess how much is coming from changes in the distribution of growth. And what we find is that 2/3 of the decline is explained by the change in inequality, and 1/3 is explained by the reduction in growth. Now, I would note, so that's one step. The way I think about this is, you can go deeper and deeper in thinking about that. So what is causing the stagnation of wages and the growth in inequality that we see in recent years? And there, I think some of the trends we're seeing in terms of investment in education, the fraying of society, lower levels of social capital and connectedness, differences in childhood environment, et cetera, some of what I was trying to get at with that more microscopic look. I think all of those factors contribute to what we're seeing.
Thank you, Raj. That was a very nice hierarchy starting at the top. Eric Horwitz.
Oh, thanks. Thanks everybody, to all the speakers for fabulous presentations and information for us. Raj, I was impressed that we going from the results in the federal affordable housing policies to actual policy, the influence of the science on Congress. And I'm curious about that link and whether you studied that carefully in terms of how that actually worked and what was the implication of the scientific results on legislation. Can you talk? It's often not a direct drive by any means.
Yes, absolutely, Eric. And I wish it was more of a direct drive. But that's an example where we were heartened to see that there was, a very direct impact. In fact, if you read the legislation, you can see how it exactly corresponds to the finding of academic studies. So I'll give you an example. One finding that we and others have documented systematically in the past 10 years is that there's a dosage effect in terms of childhood environment mattering for kids' outcomes. Every extra year that you spend in a better environment, the better you do in the long run. What is the implication of that? When you give a family a housing voucher to move to a better place, it pays off to target families with young kids because they're basically going to get a bigger dose over their childhood of that better environment, and you'll have better outcomes in the long run. So exactly in line with that, the legislation that's proposed says, let's target the housing vouchers at families with kids under age 6. So coming back to your broader question about, how can we do more of this? One thing I had not expected when starting to do more work with big data is independent of allowing you to make, sharper scientific discoveries. I think it affords a sort of transparency and communication that was previously not feasible. So one way to think about statistics, and Terry and others would, I think, connect with this view, it's basically filling in missing data problems, complex statistical models. When you have more data, in some cases, there are ways to just transparently present a set of facts in a way that policymakers, I think, from both sides of the aisle can understand, and that can move the debate forward and bring people to the table. I'll say one other thing which we found very useful in this context, and I can give other examples of this kind of direct policy impact. Framing the debate as being about equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes is critical in terms of getting people to come to the table. Everyone in America cares about equality of opportunity. As you know, there are different views about income inequality and equality of outcomes. And so I think that also matters and has led to some traction on these kinds of questions.
Yeah, thanks.
Dan Arvizu.
Yes, thank you to the three speakers. Excellent insights and very, very timely topic and subject. My question is for Raj, and it's a little bit of piggybacking on what has already been asked, but let me just make a finer point. Raj, I'm sure you've seen, there was an article, a few years ago in The Atlantic on the 0.1% disappearing middle class, something, the new American aristocracy. I'm sure you've probably seen it. It talked about similar things, how difficult it is today relative to 50 years ago when I went to school to essentially achieve that American dream. And one of the key factors, at least from what I have observed, having run an institution in the last 5 years in a very, very challenging part of the country, what we see is that the cost of education is 5 times over the last 50 years, or 4 or 5 times what it was relative to inflation, 50 years ago. So you can't get a job you can't go to school working full time at minimum wage and expect that you can make a living. You can't do that. And you could do that when I was a student. What insights have we learned from that? And is it really that simple that it's just about the income of the various cohorts that we're talking about here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. So, you're absolutely, I think everything you said is correct. And you're pointing to, I think, another lever that's extremely important in driving these differences, which is the role of higher education, access to higher education. As the cost of higher education has gone up, I think that potentially precludes some people from having opportunities for upward mobility. One thing I want to point out here, and this is again where modern linked data of the type Josh and Katie were describing as well, is extremely valuable. If I may, let me just quickly share one slide that I think sheds light on these issues. I think cost is very important, but it's not just about cost. So in our most recent study, which we put out a few weeks ago on who gets into Ivy League colleges and how this matters for later outcomes, I don't think it's merely about finances. It's also about who is getting into these institutions. Let me just quickly show you this slide here, which takes, what we've done here is linked data on SAT and ACT scores for everyone in America, to tax records, to college admissions data for 400 colleges across the US. Here I'm focusing on Ivy Plus colleges, the Ivy League, and places like Stanford, MIT, and so on. And I'm plotting your chance of attending one of these institutions for kids, all of whom have exactly the same SAT score, an SAT score of 1510, which puts you at the 99th percentile on the SAT. And if we think about the group you just mentioned, the top 0.1%, you can see that their chances of attending these institutions are like 2.5 or 3 times a middle-class kid who has exactly the same SAT scores. And so part of what we're finding with these data is that it's not merely about who can afford to go to these very expensive institutions. Many of them have very generous financial aid at this point, but it's also about the pipeline and who is getting into these places to begin with. And I think correcting things at that micro level can be an important piece of the puzzle. And in addition to, of course, thinking about Pell Grants and broader financial issues that matter quite a bit.
Thank you. Terry Tao.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So my questions are Katie. So you talk about mega studies and how these are becoming more prevalent. I'm wondering to what extent like recent research and statistics is involved in these, because many of the statistical tests that are valid for single A/B studies that do not work well for mega studies. I saw you had a slide of p-values. P-values in particular are a bit problematic. And I'm just wondering whether there's whether leading statisticians are involved in sort of making sure that the math works out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, I sort of abstracted away from that, but there's some really important issues when you run many tests at once. So we, of course, always do multiple hypothesis testing. And also you need to correct for both the winners and losers curse, right? The top sort of performers are outliers, both because of some signal and some noise. And so those corrections get applied when we do this kind of work. The other way in which I think it's really exciting to use this kind of data, though, and that where modern statistics are coming in play is that in comparison to a sort of standard A/B test where you just look at, you might be able to look at heterogeneous outcomes for different subpopulations. you're just looking at sort of like what works well, who gets the most benefit, say, out of defaults, and how does it perform for, say, those at the highest income levels and those at the lowest income levels, to tie to what Raj is talking about. When we do a mega study, we have much more, there's much more danger, right, and overfitting, but also there's this real opportunity to say not just, what subpopulations perform best with a certain intervention, but also what works best for whom. So if we want to really target a certain population, say that's vaccine hesitant or that hasn't been doing well in math, we can think about targeting in a much more effective way using modern machine learning. So those are ways that I think statisticians are contributing to the mega study work, and it's really exciting.
Thank you.
Francis Colon, please.
Thank you. And thank all three of you for your presentations. I have a quick question for Raj and a quick one for Katie. Raj, I thought about when you talked about the three policy interventions that are possible. In your third area, which you did not talk about, I know you focused on the first, did the recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action change how you think about those policy interventions in that area, and what's possible to change that mobility? And for Katie, how much did those studies that looked at the language of behavioral insights, did you look at what different demographic groups respond to? And did that change, for example, in underrepresented minorities, et cetera? Thank you.
Katie, you should go ahead, please.
Okay, I can give you a quick answer, which is we very much expected that there would be large heterogeneity as a function of those subpopulations. We didn't find much, which was pretty interesting. And it may be in part because, maybe the language was in a narrow frame. We saw a very high correlation in the best performers across demographic groups. So even though I was sort of saying, we can use this modern machine learning it didn't yield much fruit in the context of demographics, which is also interesting. Human psychology and what helps compel people who already intend to get a vaccine to follow through was pretty consistent regardless of race.
Thanks, Francis. On the first question, of course, the Supreme Court decision is causing all colleges to revisit, all institutions of higher education to revisit how they do admissions. That connects to the chart that I briefly put up there in response to one of the earlier questions, which was focused on diversity by income, not diversity by race, of course. Now, those things are correlated because race is correlated with income in America, but they are by no means the same. My own view on the issue after this recent paper that we put out is that a lot of the reaction after the Supreme Court decision, but people concerned about diversity, has been, maybe we should think about class-based affirmative action, which remains legal, given that race-based affirmative action may no longer be feasible. And perhaps that's something that we can do that would help identify people who are facing adversities or help create some racial diversity precisely because race is correlated with income. However, I actually think before we even talk about class-based affirmative action, you could think about, in a sense, removing the thumb that we currently have on the scale, in a sense, in favor of students from very high income families, partly as a result of legacy admissions, partly as a result of non-academic credentials that high-income students tend to have that lower-income students do not, all of which don't really appear to correlate with better outcomes after college. And so before we even think about, in a sense, putting a thumb on the scale for kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds, I actually think we can make quite a bit of progress by simply just getting to a more equitable place in terms of college admissions. That would not by any means solve the racial diversity issues in and of themselves, but it would free up a number of slots in a number of these colleges that could then be allocated in other ways. So, I think all of these things are going to be revisited in the coming years. And again, science and data can help us make more informed decisions in these contexts.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Francis. Maria.
Okay, thanks to all three of you for the excellent presentations, very thought-provoking. So I've got two questions. One is for Josh and one is for Katie. So Josh, let me ask you first. So this analysis that you've done about moving to more extreme positions, did that take into account ad placement or where ads get placed, as opposed to just recommendations of content in a search?
Oh, I thought you were going to say both of the questions first. Are you talking about the YouTube study or about
Yeah.
the searching for information? Yeah. So on the YouTube study, no, what we were trying to do in that study was see what happened as people moved along this traversal. And the sort of received wisdom out here was that there was this pull towards the extremes as you moved along the traversal. And the challenge here was that it's really difficult when somebody, if you're going to use something like browser tracking and just kind of watching someone as they go about doing this, it's hard to disentangle what's the algorithm versus what's the user choice. And so what we ended up doing here was coming up with this idea to do a study where we enrolled people in the study, and then we randomly assigned them a rule to choose in terms of which video to select. So some people were told, always take the second choice. Some were told, always take the fourth choice. And then the graph that I showed you before was as they went through 20 steps on this traversals. The digital footprint that I had showed you, which had all those different lines, which kind of looks like the DNA footprint, what that was doing was showing all the different recommendations that was coming from YouTube in terms of the videos. So this wasn't a study involved in looking at what ads were placed next to these videos, which would also be a super interesting question.
Yeah, that would be interesting too, because there's certainly a lot of anecdotal information that people see these ads with extreme material in them, and they're not asking for it. So I don't know, future study, I guess. So.
Yeah. No, I think that would be super interesting. And again, it's the same kind of tools that would allow us to do that. But the methods that we had here for estimating the ideology allowed us to estimate the ideology of the video. We'd have to come up with a method for estimating the ideology of the ads, but there are ways to layer that onto what we've done already, but we'd want to validate that first.
Great, thanks. That's a really helpful clarification. So Katie, you're hot off the spreadsheet final result here about the offer of a free ride to go get a vaccine. So it's sufficiently non-intuitive to me that I somehow feel like there must be something else going on here, and so I'm wondering to myself if somehow kind of the email blast or the text blast isn't reaching the people who can't afford to go and get the vaccine. So I don't know if you could just comment on that, because it sounds like you were surprised as well. So.
It's a great question. It was, we did this with CVS Pharmacy. It involved 3.5 million customers, so a really large sample with enormous diversity in terms of geography. It was from 66 of the largest metropolitan areas. We chose those specifically because they had high lift coverage, and we wanted to make sure these were places where this was a viable transportation option. And we really don't see that it works for any subpopulation. And we can look at, the income levels in those groups. It could be that the very lowest income customers have no relationship with CVS. They don't have a cell phone that CVS has on file. But again, it's such a large population, and CVS serves so many millions of customers. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say the exact numbers, but they're probably public, but it's huge. And this was a sort of random sample. I don't think that was the issue. So I think rather that this is just not as big of a barrier as we anticipated in this context. Remember, these are booster shots, so it's not the same as the initial rollout of the vaccine. But there were other studies that have been done looking at financial incentives. I was involved in an evaluation. We ran the Philadelphia vaccine sweepstakes that also shows surprising inefficacy of these traditional tools for encouraging vaccination. These kinds of sweepstakes or dollar payments had very low efficacy. So a lot of things we thought would change behavior that use traditional cost-benefit analysis weren't very effective. And I think it's a true result given the robustness in our data.
Well, this is why you do the experiment. So
exactly.
Thanks. Okay, thank you.
Great. Let's go to Lisa Cooper.
Hi. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers again. And I also have one question for Raj and one for Katie. So Raj, you were talking about, we talked about the fact that equality of opportunity seems to be more of an American value as opposed to equality of, outcomes or income specifically. And so what came to mind, and is it sort of builds on the question that we just talked about related to inequities and opportunities in higher education. I'm wondering to what extent your work looked at the differential effects of these policy experiments among people of different racial and ethnic groups, particularly because what we see in the health literature is that increases in income don't actually accrue the same benefits to people from marginalized racial groups as they do to people who come from, less disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups. So that, and then also just to what extent you looked at wealth as opposed to just family income.
Just to briefly address things. So on wealth versus income, I mean, you correctly picked up on the fact that our studies and many other recent studies focus primarily on income and not on wealth. Why is that? It's not because people are not interested in wealth. This comes back to the importance of measurement and data availability. We're able to measure income well in the US because it's taxed. We're not able to measure wealth very well because it's not systematically recorded. And so this is, I think, an opportunity where if we were able to collaborate with major financial institutions who would have records on people's wealth and link that to other types of data, that kind of architecture would make a really big difference in being able to study wealth mobility in the way that we've been able to study income mobility. On the issue of racial differences and heterogeneity and policy impacts, absolutely, there are big differences across racial groups conditional on class, both in terms of just the level of outcomes. So one of our other findings just descriptively is if you take two kids starting at the exact same income level and compare the outcomes of Black boys and white boys in the next generation, you see very stark differences with white boys much more likely to climb the income ladder than Black boys. Interestingly, if you compare Black women and white women starting out in families at the same income level, they have very similar economic outcomes, very similar college attendance rates. So there's an intersectionality between race and gender that appears quite important. And along those lines, you find that some policies are more effective among some racial and ethnic groups, others among other groups. I don't think we quite have a fully fleshed out map of which things work in which cases, but we're starting to understand these kinds of nuances better.
Thanks. Yeah, I think these are really important questions for social science to address so that people understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to many of the problems we face. So, and then on that same note, actually, for Katie, you talked about these sort of unexpected findings and the fact that certain incentives seem to work similarly across or to not work similarly across demographic groups. To what extent is your work actually incorporating more about people's attitudes and beliefs about particular issues and then tailoring the messages based on those attitudes and beliefs in order to see whether doing so actually results in better outcomes?
It's a great question. And I'm going to say something similar to Raj, which is one of the biggest challenges when we do this kind of work is data availability. And so some of the partners we work with have very rich information about the people we're targeting in our mega studies to try to change a given behavior. And some have very limited data. So sometimes we know their race, sometimes we don't. So we have to use zip code as a proxy for things like we never know their income. And that creates real challenges for answering the question that you're raising. So the short answer is we would love to be able to have attitudinal information that we could use in order to tailor. We rarely have that, right? Rarely does your pharmacy ask you questions and store them in a database in a reliable way that give us information about your attitudes towards certain things. Your doctor might have a lot of information about your health records, and so we can use things like that. We do see that some of these things matter a lot. For instance, in the recent study, almost all of the messages are much more effective with those who are older who are male rather than female, those who don't have commercial insurance, but rather Medicaid or Medicare. So they're getting bigger benefits from these kinds of interventions. We're seeing things along those lines, but I wish I had that attitudinal data and being able to find ways to link up these data sets when we do these kinds of experiments. It would add so much value and allow for some of the statistical methods we've been talking about to do their stuff and give us more prescriptive advice.
Right. I think with all the advances that we have in data, and technology, it seems like we would be able to build in ways of actually like doing the assessment in real time and then tailoring the message accordingly, like maybe a short message that just, is like, what do you think about these 5 things? And then basically delivering the prompt according to the way the person responds. But anyway,
Absolutely.
Just a thought.
You have to, one challenge with that I'll just say is you have to get people to respond, right? And so
Yes.
We run these
Absolutely.
analyses. If we, send 3.5 million text messages, one of the things we tested was, is it good to have interactivity? Will people, if you ask them a question and go back and forth, does that add value? And actually it seemed like it detracted, and most people don't respond to a text message from their pharmacy. So we do, we would love to do things like that, but the challenge is getting people to engage.
To respond. Absolutely. No, thank you.
In some
all.
settings it would work.
Thank you all on that. Andrea Goldsmith.
Thanks so much for the excellent talks. It's really very eye-opening and incredibly well done talks. My question is for Joshua, actually, and it's along the lines of both what we see in social media and its impact on society, and whether in hindsight there were policies or other things that we might have put in place to perhaps mitigate some of the damage, and if there's any lessons learned from that for AI in terms of policy or other things that the government could do to ensure that we benefit from these new technologies, but also kind of head off before they are entrenched some of the dangerous things that we've seen from them.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's a great question. My main takeaway on this is that I'm going to go back to the question of data access here, right? Which is that when social scientists have been able to get access to data, we're able to answer questions. But the paradigm that we've had for data access has been one which depends on what the platforms are able to make available and what kind of research they let happen and what kind of research they actively encourage to happen. And so that's not an optimal situation for society. We have had periods of time when it's been easier to get access to data, periods of time where it's been harder to get access to data. These things can change on a whim, where you can have, large studies set up and ready to go, and then all of a sudden the nature of the API access completely changes. So what I would think as we head into the AI era is that we have so many open question marks about what happened and when, and times that we're not able to go back to and recover the data, or even more importantly, to have run the types of studies we would have needed to run to test causal relationships at those times. And we'll never have answers to those questions. And we're often playing catch up in this regard. So I think as we look forward to AI, the number one lesson that I would think is we want a regime to make sure that what we learn about AI's impact on society is not dependent on what the AI companies decide they're going to release, or what research they decide they're going to carry out internally and then tell people about. And I think we have a lot of lessons in this regard about the types of research that can be done by external researchers, and the types of tools that we need to be able to do that research, and the types of tools that we need to be able to do that in an ethical way that is careful about people's privacy. And I think those are the lessons that I would try to apply, so that we hard bake this into the development of the field from an early day, instead of trying to play catch up with this and constantly having to be reactive to decisions that are being made by the platforms, as has been often the case with social media.
Thanks, great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Francis.
I'm going to follow up on that. I think Andrea was reading my mind. We heard from 3 speakers about 21st century social science, and all 3 rely on very large data sets. And this is true for science, right? 21st century science will also rely on access to data. what are the policy, and this follows up, Joshua, you can continue with this, but I'd also like to hear from the other speakers. What are the policy changes that would make data available? And then also, what are the downsides of making such data available? Maybe Joshua start.
Okay. Oh, sure. I thought you wanted Katie or Raj to start. Yeah. I mean, I think the kind of policy, I mean, we can look back at policy at periods of time where there was, I mean, the best thing you can have is dedicated research APIs that allow researchers to get access to the data that they need. And we have to do this in a very careful way. I mean, one of the nice things about social media data that's different from, say, medical data is that a lot of the data is public. So these clear lines you can draw about getting access to this data. But I think, and we're seeing moves in this regard in Europe in terms of the Digital Services Act, which is, setting up ways that we can request data in order to be able to access it. I think this is something that we as society have to say, hey, do we want to be in a situation where we have access to the data? We, as a society, say we need to have access to the data. We need to have these kinds of questions answered. Or do we want to just be reacting to the changes made by the platform? So I think real policies around data access, I think real policies around protecting researchers who are, for example, scraping public data that is, data that's publicly available that they're using for non-commercial purposes for research that they're going to share with the public. Protecting them in those particular cases can be really valuable. And I think we want to think even more outside the box, which is to think about the kind of models that we have, say, for banks, right, which are required to do stress tests, which are required to have regulators who are able to come in and say, hey, you are so large and you have such a potential impact on society that we need to say, not only do we need to just have observational data, but we need to say, people need to be able to come in and say, we need to run these kinds of studies. We need to design them in ethical ways, transparent ways, ways that are rigorous, scientific, but that also allow us to get at the causal types of questions that people really want answered here. And so that's the kind of policy that I'm hoping to see as we move forward. And just a general kind of recognition that the same way that we think about regulating, needing data about auto safety, the same way we think about needing data about drugs before drugs come to market, we want to think clearly about what is the needs we have as a society for understanding the impacts of these large platforms on our society.
Any downsides?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of things that we have to be super careful about here, right? We have to think very carefully about the way in which, the data that are being, all this sort of digital trace data, it contains data about individuals. And we have to think the same way we always think about working with individual data. So we have to be careful about people's privacy. We have to be careful about who gets access to this data. But I think this is something, we've long, we sort of act like this is a brand new question to ask. People have been doing research with medical data, which arguably is much more sensitive and much more private, right, than people's musings on social media. And we figured out ways to have research do this. We have researchers who do research with census data. There are all sorts of methods that are out here for doing these in ways that are safe and that are protecting people. But I think we don't want to be naive about it. When I'm saying here about data access, I'm not talking about things like, oh, data sets just need to be posted and anyone can download these data sets. There's a lot of really important innovations that have been made here in terms of like being able to do replication analysis in secure computing environments, which you have to log into, where you can run analyses on these. You can port the analyses out, but you can't port the data out, and all sorts of different things along these kinds of lines. But yeah, we absolutely want to be careful. And part of the reason we want to be careful is because we get a Cambridge Analytica, which happens, and then we have a massive retrenchment in the amount of data that's made accessible to researchers. And all of a sudden, we as the public know much, much less than we would have in the absence of that retrenchment. So we have to think about who's setting the rules for what kind of access there will be to these data, and what are our needs as policymakers? What are the questions that we want to be able to answer here? And what data will we need to have? And who gets to decide who does this research?
Right. Katie, did you want to add anything about the importance of access to data and if there are any regulatory or policy decisions that could be made to help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to take apart the two pieces. And I think it's easiest to answer about sort of from a researcher's perspective, what would be amazing? And I want to have the giant footnote that you appropriately added that, wow, are some of the ethics on this. So I'll tell you the dream, and we'll all recognize that it could be a nightmare as well in terms of privacy if we didn't do it right, or if so. Okay, from my perspective, there's two things that would be wonderful. One is if we want to do the kinds of mega studies, for instance, that I've been talking about, and we want to be able to do the kind of sort of what works best for whom analyses, having linkages is important, but also having access to really large spaces is important. So we got to work with partners like Walmart and CVS, which are massive, but sometimes there's an important policy problem. And in order to get the sample size you need aggregation. I'll give you a concrete example. We're really interested, and this relates to Raj's work, in whether or not to help students who are at risk for dropping out of college stay engaged with their studies, remain enrolled, and perform better. But the problem there is you need really big sample sizes to have the power to detect something. Even if you go to, say, an Arizona State, which is one of the largest universities in the country, you're going to be underpowered to do a mega study. So you need to start thinking, how would we link these institutions? How could we create connections so that researchers might be able to run a really large scale project targeting, and so that it's a slightly different question on data linkage, but I think it's an area where policymakers could create incentives for organizations to team up and create data access and create opportunities to run these kinds of studies. Another example would be CDC. We've talked to a lot about the work we did on vaccination. From my perspective, really, they should have been the one doing these mega studies. We sort of stepped in because we saw, hey, this needs to happen. It's not going to happen if we don't do it. But you could imagine if an organization like the CDC is the one that's trying to figure out how do we optimize messaging about some health issue, that they also could partner with Medicare and Medicaid and get a lot more information with other government programs and figure out what works best for whom, and have secure servers that allow them to do this in a way where it's safe. So that's my dream. And then I will just say the ethics of everything I just raised are tricky, and I think Josh touched on, we'd need incredibly secure servers for doing this kind of analysis, all sorts of protocols to make sure that data doesn't get into the wrong hands and create issues.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, please, Raj, go ahead.
I could just add briefly, Katie and Josh, I think have made a number of great points. I just want to make two practical suggestions I think a committee like this could have a big impact on. So first, thinking about federal government data, I think there's a tremendous amount that can be done by simply having more effective data sharing between federal government agencies. So to give you an example, some of the work we touched on earlier, people who are interested in higher education. So some of the work we've been able to do in that space and make public statistics on how much each college is contributing to economic mobility in America come from linkage of tax records held by the IRS to Department of Education data on Pell records, for example, to, ideally other sources of data like census data, which would allow breakdowns by race and ethnicity, as was asked about earlier. So all of that data is there, in principle, could be linked every year, and you could have statistics on what colleges are doing in terms of diversity and outcomes systematically reported. And, rather than that happening at an annual level, what ends up happening is at some point, our team is able to get access to these various things, put out these statistics for one particular year. The main question we're asked is, how is this changing over time? Colleges would like to monitor their performance, see what things are working and so forth. This is a completely solvable problem. Somebody's just got to focus the attention on getting everybody to be able to share the data, given the various restrictions that are in place and so forth. That is one of many, many examples that I think would have incredible impact in terms of making things more transparent and teaching us what works.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just, Raj, keep going if you had another point.
I was just going to say then separately, so that's in the federal government context. And then separately, as the others have emphasized, I think there's a great deal to be learned from private sector data as well. And there the issues are different. I think the main issue, again, working like a company like Meta, sometimes interested in supporting a big research project, but what are the incentives for those private companies to do that? I think thinking about how you create an architecture where that is incentivized is very valuable, and is again something where the government could potentially play a role. And I think all of the issues of privacy are very important, but advances in fields like the differential privacy literature, which some here will be familiar with, I think can provide precise statistical safeguards against the types of issues we might be worried about.
Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion. I'm just going to pile on to say, I think you hit on, I believe, a key word when you said incentives. I think that's not just about Meta, but it's also a big part of why that's such a hard problem to get administrative data to be available in appropriate ways from within government. Because, of course, imagine that you have responsibility for tax records or census data or any of these other private, like deeply private information. Unlike a company, a government agency has to put that privacy is sacrosanct. And the government agency does not get rewarded for sharing that data. So it's a different kind of incentives problem, but it's still an incentives problem. And then I think you mentioned differential privacy, Raj, and others have talked about privacy technologies of various sorts. And I remain optimistic, but a little frustrated because we've had so many components of privacy technologies for so long, and yet it is still this bespoke, incredibly painful undertaking for every problem you want to solve. And so I think we're still far from being able to harness the power of those technologies to get to a future where we do rigorously protect privacy and yet have access to these rich data sources. So I really appreciate the direction of this conversation. I think it's there's a lot of potential here. And as Fung.
Thank you. I want to get back to the American dream. Raj, in your map of upward mobility, Dubuque, Iowa stands out as a good example. $45.5 thousand. What is the lesson to be learned from Dubuque, Iowa? You didn't mention at all investment in teachers and early education. So can you comment on what we can learn from Dubuque, Iowa?
Yeah, thank you, So of course, it's hard to learn from any one data point in isolation, but what I can tell you is about places that have high levels of upward mobility. And I think Dubuque actually, in fact, will embody many of these factors that I'm about to mention. So what we've done is we and many other social scientists using that data and the opportunity atlas that we've made public from the tax records, correlated those measures of upward mobility with many other measures of neighborhood characteristics that people have thought might matter, such as the quality of schools, rates of poverty, family structure measures, and so on. And in brief, while there are many, many different things that people have looked at and could potentially matter, I would highlight 4 factors that people have identified as being very strong predictors of differences in upward mobility. The first is how mixed income in an area is. In places where you have low-income people and high-income people living together, you tend to have much higher levels of upward mobility than in places with concentrated poverty. Second, you find that places with stronger family structures, so one way to measure that is more two-parent families. Just as a correlational matter, it is a fact in the data that places where there are more two-parent families tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. Third, exactly as you're getting at, places with stronger schools, both at the K through 12 level and access to higher education, which can come from higher quality teachers, perhaps greater expenditures in the school leading to smaller class sizes, a variety of factors, tend to have higher levels of mobility. And then finally, and I think in some ways most important, places with more social capital of a very particular form, connection between low and high income people, which we've measured in a recent study using Facebook data, the extent to which low and high income people are friends with each other, zip code by zip code in America. If I showed you a map of that, you would basically not be able to tell the difference between that map and the map of upward mobility from the tax records that I showed you. Now, coming back to Dubuque, if you think about all of those factors, Dubuque would score very highly on all 4 things. Iowa is known historically to have a very strong education system. It's a place where there's a lot of connection between low and high income people. It's a relatively low inequality place, and the demographics and family structure would look favorable. So that's not necessarily a definitive, complete answer, but it's that type of thing that I think is going.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Steve Bacala.
I want to thank all three speakers for great examples of how at-scale field work can teach us how to modify behavior. You know, the methods of, you know, big science, the budgets of big science, the cast size of big science, and the energy of big science are clearly working in your fields. I want to thank you all for never uttering the phrase focus group during any of your presentations. The question here is, where in the federal government have these messages been embraced? Where agencies or groups within government are investing the kind of effort and the kind of money to learn how well their policies are working and who is lagging the most. I'll give you one example. I worry that the Department of Energy implementing the Inflation Reduction Act acknowledges that communities' acceptance of renewables deployment is like the critical thing. And yet, where is the experimental, system that is going to figure out what works and what doesn't, right? So, can you comment on it? Can you help us with who's doing it well and who isn't doing it well?
I can take a really quick crack, and I bet Josh and Raj can add all sorts of color that I am unaware of. But from my perspective, when I think about where behavioral insights at least live in government, so this is like my little niche, there was a big change around 2014 when in the Obama administration, they created a science, they created a behavioral science team inside the White House. But then when Trump came in office, that basically sort of disbanded and it went into OES. And I think there's still actually about 50 people there, and their specialty is in designing these kinds of trials. And they sort of try to field requests from all different government agencies if they're trying to figure out, how do we test and what should we do to make this communication better or to make this program more straightforward. So there is a group, but it seems like it's kind of a ragtag team. You kind of have to know about the OES crew and raise your hand and ask for help. And it would be wonderful if there was a more concentrated, large investment, and if each, frankly, government organization had its own behavioral science team embedded. Again, one of the groups I've talked with the most after some of our mega study work was the CDC, because the implications of our work on vaccine communication were so clear for the CDC. And there are folks there who are saying, we should be doing this every time, whether we roll out, a vaccine for, monkeypox or a new COVID booster, we should know what's the best communication strategy that we should be using. And so, but it doesn't exist. And I think that it should. It seems clear that it should. And all we've got is a sort of ragtag bunch at the OES. So I'm very curious what Josh and Raj have to say.
I'll just interject that OES, if people weren't trying, it's Office of Evaluation Services and Sciences. And it started out of that Obama push, but it's part of the General Services Administration. It's a service available across government. And to Katie's point, I think a very important start. Please keep going, others.
I'm happy to chime in. My experience has been working with many different government agencies and folks in government over the years that there's heterogeneity, not merely at the agency level, but at the person level. It so happens you get one person who is interested in studying, say, the housing voucher program in a systematic way, and that really has an impact. Or there's a senator who takes an interest in a particular education policy. And so I think what would be really valuable is figuring out how we systematize that, rather than a lot of this is just so happens to be that there's a connection made between two people and there's a focus on evaluating one particular policy, and you learn that it could be done much more efficiently, et cetera. One thing that I would add methodologically to what Katie said, which I absolutely agree with, it would be great to be able to do experimental work, particularly in the context of behavioral insights systematically, is there are many cases in government policies where randomized experiments are going to be challenging. Ideally, we would do them, but it's really quite costly or technically infeasible, or there are political constraints that prevent that. And I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned from observational data as well, because effectively, if you think about it creatively and have enough data, there are always natural experiments that you can find where somebody tried to implement something for one set of cohorts in one place, but not another. Modern statistical methods, I think, have made a lot of progress in basically, causal inference with observational data. Not quite the same as a randomized experiment, but I think often with plausible assumptions, we can make quite informed judgments. And I think empowering agencies and government officials to do that systematically alongside the tools of randomization would be quite valuable as well.
Josh, anything to add?
Not much in this regard. I mean, I think it's an interesting question with social media and politics, because on the one hand, at the micro level, I think there are tons of people in government thinking all the time about how they can use social media to get their message out and how they can monitor social media to try to figure out what their supporters and what the publics are thinking. On the other hand, at the macro level, there are big questions about, the idea of, should government be using social media as a way to try to measure public opinion about issues? I mean, I think back to Katie's point earlier when there was a question for Katie about, how do you know what types of messages people are using? And Katie's answer, well, it's really hard to get people to tell us this. They won't answer surveys. But that's one of the things you can do with public social media data, is that you can actually see how people on their own are talking about different issues. And so so I think, if I was to point to, on the other hand, because social media is such an immediate experience for everyone, I think there is this overwhelming tendency to sort of generalize away from your experience and think that there are these sort of quick answers to what social media is doing. And what I've been trying to show you here today is that actually a lot of these questions that make their way into the punditocracy about the social media causes this or doesn't do this, sometimes it does, right? But sometimes it turns out it doesn't. So it would be great to see more people thinking seriously about the kinds of studies that researchers are doing to not just get their information about social media from their own impressions, but from thinking about this as the same kind of thing where we need this same sort of rigorous scientific research we need in these other areas. And I am encouraged that there are I think there are more people now thinking about this question of data access. I think that the Digital Services Act in the European Union is focusing, in Europe anyway, people's thoughts on what sort of data needs to be in the hands of researchers so people can get this kind of rigorous analysis of what's happening and the impact of social media on society. And I think there are bills that have been introduced, so there are more examples of ways that people are thinking about, recognizing the importance of this kind of research. Especially in such a fast-moving environment. Raj showed these great charts like going back to 1940s, right? If I showed, Facebook usage going back to 1940s, most of that would be quite an empty picture. And so it's such a fast-moving environment. I think, the more help you can do to sort of let people know about that, yes, you can do this same kind of rigorous research. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes these kind of large lab-based efforts. I think that in the long term will have, real payoff for, people understanding the implications of policies that are being discussed and that they might want to implement in this area.
I'm going to tag on one last thing on this topic, which is the Evidence-Based Policy Act, which starts moving agencies in the direction of harnessing and using data to evaluate what they do. Part of that is the National Secure Data Service, which I'm hopeful will be helpful in some of the privacy and data access issues that we talked about. So there are a lot of things happening and a lot of work and opportunity ahead. We need to wrap in just a couple of minutes. I'll turn to Saul for a last quick question and answer. Saul Perlman.
Sure. First of all, great talks, great field you guys have. Josh, I want to just ask you, your work and others have shown that many of the stories that we've been using to explain how online platforms spread misinformation or create polarization are probably not the main story. So I'm curious, in your work or others, have you started to see any surprising causes that could be opportunities for effective policy? And then, and that's a quick question. And the other one was, for the European Digital Services Act that's opening up data and maybe dedicated research APIs, will that provide information that we need both in the US or is it just in Europe? And so those
short answer. Yeah. Thank you.
Both great questions. On the Digital Services Act, I mean, it all still remains to be seen, but that is a legitimate concern. And it would obviously be, I mean, we could solve this problem by having something similar in the United States, which would then guarantee that this access would be available to American researchers and with American data. We'll have to see how the Digital Services Act plays out in practice. It's still very much in that implementation phase, other than the guidelines of data should be made available for researchers for these particular reasons. And there are lots of people, I can connect you with people who are who know the ins and outs of these sorts of things. I think I'll close on your question about interesting things that are coming up around polarization by linking back to what Raj talked about. And I think, you know, I think one of the, as you correctly note, Saul, there are more and more, studies coming out that are pushing back on these kind of very simple one-to-one explanations of how we could, I would say, how we could lessen political polarization in this in this country by just changing things about the social media environment. One of the most interesting things I'm seeing, linking to what Raj started with, is things that look at the intersection between people's online world and their offline world. Right. And so there's some very interesting research that's being done about online geographic segregation and its relationship to politics, and the way in which we are now in a period of time where more Democrats are living with more Democrats and more Republicans are living with more Republicans. And much as Raj has talked about the economic implications of when you have geographic segregation, there seem to be strong political implications of geographic segregation by politics. Now, it's a lot harder how we think about,
Joshua,
kind of
I think we're running up against.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So if you would just wrap, I think that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Online and offline relationships. That's
great. Perfect. This was an amazing discussion. Huge kudos to our three speakers for stimulating such a great conversation. I think we're going to have a lot to chew on for a long time. I really appreciate the effort that you all put into this and our organizers as well. We had no requests for public comments, so that's the end of this session. The recording from this event and the slide presentations that go along with it are going to be available on the PCAST website next week, and there'll be a lot to review. So please go there and enjoy at your leisure. Any last remarks from Francis or Maria?
Well, it's be interesting to talk more about this topic and how we can use it to build community in our country. There's data is power.
Thank you for this introduction to 21st century social science. It looks very exciting future. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.